We've all experienced the Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. We're now on the cusp of Web 3. Web 3 has the potential to change the very structure of business and government. It will likely change how consumers interact with businesses and each other and how businesses coordinate their activities. But what exactly is Web 3? Welcome to W3B Talks, an ongoing exploration of the technologies and impact of the second era of the internet, built on Web3 and blockchain technologies. My name's Doug Heintzman. I'm the Chief Catalyst at the Blockchain Research Institute. In this episode, we're going to try to answer the very basic question of what is Web3 and why is it important? To help us with this discussion, I am joined by Irving Wladawsky-berger. Irving is the legendary IBM executive that headed up IBM's Internet division in the 1990s. He's also a research affiliate at MIT's Sloan School of Business, an adjunct professor at Imperial College London, chairman of the advisory board at R4 Technologies, and a longtime advisor and collaborator with the Blockchain Research Institute. Welcome to the podcast, Irving. We both have been through a number of important era transitions, ranging from the onset of the first version of the internet to various different iterations of the internet and the mobile internet, the social internet, cloud computing, and we find ourselves on the cusp of an exciting new era. And Irving, I'm going to start with kind of a question that goes back a number of months ago as we were talking about rebranding this conference, right? Previously, it's been known as Blockchain Revolution Global, which of course was a derivative of the book Blockchain Revolution by Don and Alex Tapscott. And we decided that we had reached a maturity and kind of a new common vocabulary in the industry that was suggesting that we really need to broaden our horizon and to rebrand this Web3 and blockchain world. And I remember at the time, you were actually, a naysayer. You were quite taken aback and you protested this. And that over a period of a number of weeks, as we kind of got more into it and did a more reading, you kind of changed your opinion and have now become quite an enthusiastic backer of this concept. So let's start with that. I mean, why were you resistant to this idea, and what's changed?
Well, Doug, first of all, it's a pleasure talking to you. The one affiliation I'm not sure you mentioned is that I am also part of the research group of Blockchain Research Institute. So I've been affiliated with BRI for a few years now, and I've attended the various meetings and so on.
And you also chair the jury for the Web3 and Blockchain Transformation Awards.
Right, I've done that. This is my third year doing that. So when I first heard that we were changing the conference and the awards to the W3B Transformation and W3B Awards, I wasn't expecting it. And part of what happened is, at the time, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, I hadn't wrapped my head around what Web3 was. I just hadn't thought about it. I obviously had thought a lot about blockchain for a number of years. That's why I've been involved with you all at BRI. But I hadn't thought about Web3, and a number of the things that I read about said, well, is it real? Is it hype? There was a lot of allusion to crypto and coming from Web3 from the crypto world. There was quite a bit of discussion of things like decentralized autonomous organizations as a major part of Web3. And when I started reading about it, the way it had been described, most people described it is Web 1 was the original internet. The internet that I was very involved with in the 90s when we organized IBM's internet division and we put together IBM's business strategy and so on. That's Web 1, and that was this very almost romantic decentralized, everybody will be able to do whatever they want to, power to the individuals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
But it was also, it was fundamentally a read web, right? I mean, it originally came out of this idea of binding a bunch of academic institutions to share research, right? So
yes.
It was largely a publication and read web.
Yeah, but in fact, the reason the internet was first started by the U.S. Department of Defense, so that in the late 60s, so that in the case of a nuclear attack, remember we were in the middle of the Cold War, there was a very resilient way of communicating. There was a very good way to communicate back and forth. And then the research community, as well as government and universities, continued developing and developed TCP/IP and other things. And it eventually became the universal way for the research communities to communicate with each other. The networking, of course, the email, IMAP and POP and so on were very associated with the internet. And a little bit later, out of CERN, Tim Berners-Lee came out with the World Wide Web. And I've
actually been at CERN and stood in front of the next cube that Tim Berners-Lee wrote, the web on. And it was, I can't tell you how exciting it was. It was just like, wow, look at that. It's so cool.
It was the point where I think Al Gore deserves huge credit because he was really pushing this. He didn't invent the internet, but he was a very strong advocate. And we all said, oh my God, we can communicate with anybody with a PC and a browser can now communicate with anyone in the world. Businesses, all kinds of new startups can get going. You can get access to information over the web on almost any topic. It really was about us positive. In fact, the term that I remember in one of the early talks I gave, people talked about a global village. All of a sudden, the planet was become a global village. Great. Then came in the early 2000s, Web 2. And Tim O'Malley is the one who came up with the name Web 2, the major publisher of technology material out in Silicon Valley. And Web 2 really was, instead of just being able to access information, people now could, through social media, create information. You can create blogs, the social media platforms started, including Facebook and later Twitter and so on. And everybody was very happy that that this could become a very creative way of creating content.
Right. So it became a read-write web.
Yeah, a read-write web and get access to information as well as create information web. But then what happened, a couple of things happened that, first of all, the internet companies started to centralize because the more data companies got, and Amazon was already starting to be a power in e-commerce, Facebook was beginning to be a power in social media. Google, of course, was a power in search and so on. Apple was growing by leaps and bounds. So two major things happened, I think. Instead of the highly decentralized democratic internet of Web 1, we now had the highly centralized internet of Web 2 that was highly dominated by a few mega players, which I've listed. And by the way, there was Alibaba and others in China also.
Right, and those major platform players, because of the architecture of the web were able to capture the lion's share of the new value that was created.
Right. And one of the main reasons they were able to capture that is because the more data you were able to get, the more you can then analyze the data and, let's say, figure out what ads to sell to send somebody when do they a search like Google did.
Right.
Or in the case of Amazon, what product recommendations to make to you.
Well, actually, it's a good point you make, because there's a lot of people, don't really appreciate just how much information that these platforms have captured and how they're how they're creating value. Because you use the example of Amazon. I mean, the brilliance of Amazon was that they were able to harness their customers' efforts, who would write product reviews, which would add content to the platform, which would help other people buy stuff. And that was kind of active feedback. But they also got passive feedback because they knew the pattern that said, well, people that buy these things also buy those things. So they were able to monetize that passive information.
Exactly. They were able to start applying early versions of AI algorithms, machine learning algorithms, to learn, gee, Doug is like Irving. What do these nerdy kinds of guys like to buy? And let's analyze the group of nerds that we have. Oh, let's send them ads about technology, because these guys seem to like about technology. By the way, Amazon did something very clever also, which is they didn't just sell things from Amazon. They also started selling things from other vendors in their platform, because the more products they could offer, the more users they were able to attract, the more data they were able to gather, the more they were able to sell. So that's one thing. And then, of course, we got all the issues with social media and misinformation, because companies like Facebook and Twitter and others figure out, in order to sell you more ads, we need to keep you on the platform. If you only spend a little time, we don't have enough time to sell you stuff, to ads. And they learn that people react much more strongly to things that make them angry than to things that make them happy. So if you can start, and by the way, this is all AI, you figure out, gee, when we showed Doug things that he reacted angrily, he stayed longer and he started sending stuff. So this is a kind of hype machine, which, one of my colleagues at MIT, Sinana Rao, wrote that book, and it led to all kinds of misinformation. That's Web 2.
Okay,
so centralized, and as a result, too much misinformation.
Okay, so what has changed? What's the big deal?
So now people started saying it's time to get back to the original democratic internet of Web 1, but let's also keep the ability for users to create and to get rewarded for their creation as they do in Web 2. So we want to start decentralizing, and let's figure out where this takes us. But when I started reading about this, that was the extent to what I was reading. Since like crypto are emerging and so on, we don't like how centralized things got, let's decentralize. And I remember, for example, one of the things that was part of the Web3 thinking is decentralized autonomous operation, DAOs. I'm sure you've heard about DAOs. And which is, so rather than having a hierarchy managing a company, whatever, let all the people contributing decide how to run the company. Well, I've been in companies, you need governance. That sounds like a 12-year-old saying that they don't like capitalism. Let's all get together and vote.
Yeah.
And
anarchy is a perfectly viable political structure. Sure.
Yeah, well, maybe it's not anarchy, maybe it's power to the people, but it's very fine to try to distribute much more power to the people, but that has to manage. If you don't manage it, then you get anarchy.
Okay, so once again, what's the light bulb went off for you that was like, wait a second, something else, something big is going on here.
Something big. And the thing that went on in my mind was, yes, it's time to see what the next future of the internet was, but let's correct the biggest deficiencies of this previous version of the internet, and let's look at the evolution of the internet. This is very important, not over the next 2-3 years, over the next 10, 15 years, because these things will take time.
Okay, let's start building. So the building blocks. So the first big idea you talked about was, let's correct the original sin of the internet, the essential deficiency. And the term that you've used in some of the papers we've written together to kind of talk about this idea is the concept of state, right? Yes. State being the remembrance of things, the record of what happened, which is so fundamental. And today, most of these third parties, whether it's a bank or a telecommunications company or it's Amazon or Google, they own the state. They own the record of things happening.
Because that's the only place. State means data. That is, let's take a very specific example. More and more business around the world is being done with ecosystems of companies working together, whether it is supply chains, which is a very big deal, whether it is in healthcare, where different institutions have to collaborate, the healthcare providers, the insurance companies, the hospitals, and so on, whether it is financial, whether it's an academia. And when those companies are collaborating, it would be nice for them to share information. But what happens is there is no place in today's internet where you can keep that information. Within a company, you keep it in the company's database. And in fact, in the 90s, with enterprise resource planning, ERP, one of the main things that ERP did is develop this notion of a central database that all the different functions of the company can share information to become much more efficient. We didn't have that for companies to become much more efficient, except we had a major innovation. Guess what that major innovation was? A way of sharing information securely between companies.
And what's that called?
Well, what's the name of BRI?
Well, that's blockchain technology. And
exactly.
I think what you're telling me is that the big idea behind blockchain is that state information, right, that the remembrance of transactions and the data that underlies them is no longer owned by platform companies. It becomes an inherent characteristic of the network.
And remember, only the information needed for those companies to manage their supply chain, to manage their healthcare. That is, they will have other information, paying their employees, a strategy for themselves, that they'll keep in their private database. But when it comes to the kind of information that is the transactions among companies that are doing business with each other, or medical records across many institutions that have medical records, or financial records, there was no place to keep that information except in the databases of each individual company. And then when you had to do something, because I don't know, we weren't sure if you sent me the right stuff, if the invoice was right, then bureaucracies had to get involved and help you sort out what happened, which would take time and so on, because there was no database. So one of the really big ideas for this next evolution of the internet was to create a blockchain-based stateful internet that would enable ecosystems of institutions to work closely together with much more security and much more efficiency.
Okay,
and I could get very excited about.
Right. So, well, you're jumping ahead one chapter in the story that I was trying to tell. But so you've got this new stateful engine, and that allows for the creation of some pretty powerful new primitives, right? That primitives, the core building blocks upon which you can build stuff, right? It allows for you to build distributed governance systems that make the environment very, very stable to be invested in, whether it's the investment of time and energy or programming. It's no one company can go and arbitrarily change the rules on you. It's a very, very stable environment for investment, right? Number one. Number two, it allows for something called smart contracts, which allows for automation. So it's not just confidence in the data, it's confidence in the business logic that's manipulating the data.
Precisely. That is a brilliant point. And by the way, this is very important, Doug. As it turned out, we needed a distributed database with a number of characteristics. And blockchain, in my mind, because we're thinking about the business and institutional applications, government, healthcare, etc., had the permission blockchains had just the kinds of properties. As you know so well, everything in blockchain is encrypted. When the data travels through the networks, it's all highly encrypted. Every member of that particular ecosystem of companies has a copy of the blockchain, and the data in it is non-revocable, which means that the issue of trust, that's why the security is so important. You could not have a bad person run away and start doing things. And then, of course, you then have consensus where people vote. So the blockchain that has been created and that BRI has been working so hard on over the years was the perfect distributed database for these ecosystems of companies to start becoming far, far, far more efficient than before. In fact, I think of that as ERP 2.0.
Right. Okay, so we have this stateful engine, we have confidence in collective business logic, and that allows us to have all kinds of other very powerful primitives ranging from digital identity and self-sovereign digital identity to any number of digital assets that allow us to create distributed governance models and to exchange value. It allows the whole concept of ownership, whether that's ownership of something that represents a value or it represents a right or a privilege. And it allows us to build economies around all those things.
Exactly. And one you mentioned already, but let me build on the notion of identities. The biggest issue in today's internet is security and privacy. Do you agree?
I think so. I think they're not only fundamental human rights, I think they're actually core technology and societal primitives, right? I think they go hand in hand with the concept of ownership.
And look at, we're all so worried about identity theft look at all the hacking things. Our data doesn't feel very private and so on.
Well, and people are earning lots of money on the backs of our work, and we're not participating in that value creation. That's all about identity.
Now, so one of the promises of Web3, and remember, this is very important. Promise means there is quite a bit of work to be done. In fact, I think that's why BRI embraced Web3, because BRI says, well, the name says Blockchain Research Institute. It's working on the next turn of the crank of research, is the notion of how do we increase the security and identity of the internet. The research community has been working on digital identities, essentially the combination of private public keys that identifies you, and that could be kept in what's called the hardware secure element of your mobile device, which is very, very secure. And mobile devices have it. Each one does it a little bit differently, which is a problem. And instead of having to have an email and a password for logging into the gazillion of websites and applications we log into, use your very secure digital identity on a secure element to get you access to the internet, to the website, to the application. That's one of the promises here. And then there is no password to steal. That's really a big deal. Right. There is no password to remember, and there is no password to steal. And so a number of the people that I work with at MIT and people in IBM and in other institutions have been working on digital identities. And the feeling is that the timing is ripe to make that one of the major objectives of Web3, is to start adding the notion of digital identities to make doing our individual transactions, let alone business. That's what Don and Alex Tapscott called create the true Internet of Value, where you can have very safe transactions.
Right.
So that's another gigantic area that we hope to start building up in Web3 in the next generation of the Internet.
Okay, so we've patched some of the architectural and technology holes in the infrastructure of the Internet that is allowing us to have these multi-party transactions in very confident ways. It allows for trust to be embedded in the fabric of the network. It allows for these very powerful primitives to be to come into existence that programmers and businesses can leverage, which kind of takes me to what I think of as maybe the most important word in all of this, and that is composability.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, composability is a very big idea, right? We all have used Lego systems that yes, you can follow the instructions and you can create a Death Star or whatever. Yes, you can go out and get other adjacent things and compose them, and they become part of that ecosystem. But you can also take the building blocks and recompose them, reconfigure them into completely original and new sorts of things.
Right.
So the idea of composability. Right, and I like going back and looking at history. Right, in the mid-1500s, there were some important new decentralized technologies invented. A permissionless communication protocol called the printing press, and then a system for asset registration, which is the double entry accounting system. And those two primitives led to an extraordinary explosion of growth, right? To the Renaissance, to the Enlightenment, to the Scientific Revolution, to the First Industrial Revolution. Extraordinary creation of value and innovation and new ideas, and better literacy and information moving around and higher degrees of trust. So, I mean, as I look at a system like the Web3 technologies and the underlying blockchain operating system, and its ability to give us this very highly stable, distributed governance model with all these very powerful primitives that is inherently composable. And look at the example of the DeFi space growing from 10 to $250 billion in 2 years. It did that because all of that innovation was so composable, and they found all kinds of new ways of creating value and addressing various different niches in the marketplace and recombining themselves. So,
by the way, you said something very important.
Sure.
Let me add something. You said distributed governance. This is very important.
Okay.
Because some of the hype, and let me say by hype, I mean, I don't understand, is when you say, no, just being decentralized and autonomous will make all this work. And the answer is, I'm sorry, that's not how things work. If you want more decentralized or distributed governance, it's still governance. That is, you have to sit back, you have to create what are the rules of the road, what can you do, what you cannot do. But without the underlying infrastructure we've been talking about, blockchain-based distributed databases, highly secure digital identities, and a few other major primitive secure elements, those are in the infrastructure. Without them, you cannot now start building the applications and governance on top of it to accomplish what you're talking about. But now that we have this, when I say we have, now that we are developing, this is, look, Doug, it's very important to remember we are in the first inning of this major adventure. So it's very important that people realize the reason BRI got involved is because it's a research institution, and a lot of the institutions BRI works with, which are universities, startups, big companies, governments, they are participating in the research. So there is a lot of fascinating research we can now do where before there was no common infrastructure and vocabulary to do that research. And once I understood, so that's what Dan and Alex and you and others in BRI, that's what you had in mind when you switched to W3B. I said, sign me up. I think this is the most fascinating project I can imagine for looking at the future of the internet.
Yeah, it's something you just said actually tweaked off a bit of a thought that I think is actually a really important point, because a lot of people think of this technology as being disruptive. But if you kind of look at business management theory, disruptive technology just simply means that something's been invented that changes the cost basis and allows you to address longer tail and eventually go and eat up an incumbent and change the model, right? It's Netflix versus Blockbuster Video. That's a disruptive technology. Web3 and blockchain isn't technically a disruptive technology. It'll certainly disrupt lots of industries, lots of companies. It's a foundational technology. And foundational technologies typically have kind of a 30 to 40 year adoption before it's just, that's the way it is. And why would it be any different?
Yeah, it's a foundational technology that's very much the evolution of the internet.
Right.
So we can really transform it into a very safe, secure internet of value where we can do transactions. That's what, in Dan and Alex's book, they called it the internet of value. We couldn't do that before. And as a result, things got a little bit messy. We saw the identity theft. The reason these mega companies were born is because as they were doing this, by collecting huge amounts of private data. But the problem is we don't just want to have, 3-4 companies manage all this stuff. That's not the way the internet was supposed to work. So now those companies are not doing anything bad. That's capitalism. If you can become a monopoly, more power to you. Government shouldn't allow that, but that's a separate discussion. Well, because in the end, it's not good for society.
Okay, so we've talked about, and I'm glad you mentioned society. But we've talked about blockchain technology being this new operating system that infuses the internet with some important, very important new capabilities, which has potentially dramatic impact on business and society. But Web3 is actually a bigger topic than just blockchain, right? There are some other core, very important technologies that happen to be maturing in a way that intersects with and is very complementary to the capabilities of blockchain, and they collectively are known as Web3. So we have the state engine, blockchain, is kind of the basic operating system. What are the other components that are part of Web3?
Well, remember, because we are developing Web3, everybody will have a different opinion of what's in Web3 and what is not. Don't forget that.
Fair enough. But
I'm giving you a personal opinion.
Fair enough.
But it's one where I've thought. Something I've become very excited about, if you have a digital identity that you carry around that lets you log in, when I say carry around, in your mobile device, that lets you log in securely into all this stuff, where in the mobile device do you carry it? Well, where do you carry your ID cards in the physical world? You have a wallet, right? So you carry it in your digital wallet. Now you could say, Irving, I thought we already have digital wallets. There is one in the iPhone, there is one in the Android-based devices, and so on. Yeah, but here is the problem. They are each different. And if you really want to make life easier for people, you don't want them to have totally different ways of accessing things depending on where they are. Just last week, the Linux Foundation, which is the biggest open source organization in the world, started an open wallet foundation. And the reason that's so important is to try to develop, not every company has its own wallet. The analogy in my mind is the browser. If you could only access a website with a certain browser, then when you want to go to a website, you have to figure out which browser to use. And Doug, do you remember the browser wars of the 90s?
Of course I do. Absolutely. I was in the middle of it.
And eventually what was settled is, no, you cannot do that. A browser has to be able to get you access to every website. You can build on top of it different characteristics that you think are better. I think wallets are at that stage.
Okay.
We need a common wallet across devices and laptops and PCs that carry our digital identities and other key information. Again, we're in the research stage. If you ask me, does that exist? No. But the fact that the Linux Foundation has set this up, and again, quite a number of people are working on digital IDs to be very safe, to be carried in this wallet. It's like when you mention blockchain doesn't just have the data. What blockchain also allowed us to build is smart contracts, which are software that helps us automate processes across institutions. So a well-designed infrastructure is very powerful not just for what it is, but for the new mechanisms that it lets you build on top of that.
Okay,
we are at that research stage.
Okay, so we've got the concept of digital identity and a wallet, right? That's a big element that lots of stuff in the Web3 world gets built on top of. What are the other kind of beyond blockchain elements of Web3?
Well, some of them we've talked about, but I think it's too early to tell. Let's take user interfaces. You may not agree with me, but I'm old enough so that when I started using computers, it was green screens and text.
Well, me too.
Then came graphical user interface, the GUI, which was first brought out by the Mac, the Apple computers. Then it was picked up by Windows, by browsers. Do you know when the GUI was created? What decade?
It was 1962 or something? It was
No. When did the Apple? It was the 1980s.
Well, that was 1980. It was Apple, but Park Research did that work earlier than that.
They did the research, but it didn't get to market.
Yeah. It's 1982 or so.
Yeah, Xerox PARC did it. Though, in many ways, that's the last major advance in user interface, and it is the GUI. Now, there's a lot of talk about the metaverse as taking it to the next level. Now, the problem is there is no agreement on what that is. If you talk to Facebook, they said, no, this is what the interface is. Microsoft has their ideas. And there is only one place that is really, really, really advanced in the next generation user interfaces, which is the gaming world. World of Warcraft and fantasy worlds and virtual worlds. But let's you and I agree that that's not the business world, that's not the government world, that's not healthcare. So it would be nice to have this major breakthrough as we are living our lives online much more, for interacting with applications in a much friendly way. And I think that over time, that will be one of the things in Web3, but I don't know what it is yet, because I don't see the agreements of commonality.
Okay, but I'll give you...
I don't know if you see that differently.
Yeah, no, I'll give you that augmented reality and virtual reality, the spatial internet, will afford us all kinds of new kinds of interactions with each other and with the way that we interact with systems, data, and businesses. And I'll even give you that perhaps one of the really big things here actually isn't, faster graphics processors or better goggles, but in fact that we now have digital assets, and that this is why this is different than Second Life, right? That we can actually create entire economies and business models in these spatial environments that we weren't able to do before. Okay, so we've got that component. Any other major components of Web3? What about measurement? Measurement?
What do you mean measurement?
IoT, right? The ability to understand what's going on in the world.
IoT, everything you and I have talked about. Remember, IoT doesn't exist in isolation. The IoT applications, think of where you apply IoT, smart cities with devices all over the place, smart factories with all kinds of things from all kinds of people, smart hospitals with things all over the place. So IoT will benefit incredibly from having the stateful internet, which will allow their different components to work with each other. And it will benefit tremendously from this world of highly secure digital identities. So your car with all these intelligent smart IoT devices cannot be hacked. Or in healthcare, I don't know, your heart pacer, as in an episode of Homeland, I don't know if you watch Homeland, that
I know what you're referring to. Yeah.
I think the vice president was...
Yeah, it's a common trope in TV
It's
series.
a common trope. Yeah. So if anybody needs highly secure devices, right, IoT, so the kind of infrastructure you and I have talked about is, in fact, it's possible that one reason IoT hasn't advanced more is because we haven't had these infrastructures.
We haven't been able to ledger all of that data to support the machine-to-machine economy.
We haven't been able to do that. So yes, this would let IoT finally take off as it should, and we'll see where that takes us. That's what major things we can expect to build up from that.
Yeah, the other major building block that I've been following for a very long time, and I think like IoT, that when you put it into this constellation with these other technologies underneath the title of Web3, that it really starts to be massively impactful, and that's the whole concept of prediction, right? And driven by artificial intelligence. That prediction becomes a commonplace service. Yes. I mean, if you think about driving in a modern electric vehicle, you've got all these IoT sensors that are collecting all the data, but then you've got these predictive engines that are figuring out what's going on and deciding what is going to happen next, and then guiding your behavior. And there's all kinds of analogs in the business world for where prediction, whether it's running a supply chain or whether it's running a political campaign or whether it's doing almost anything. Weather.
You're absolutely right. And remember, the key to these predictions is data, right? I mean, if you look at the companies that have been most advanced in AI, are companies that have had access to the biggest amount of data. Now, if all of a sudden we want economies and institutions of societies to be able to, let me use the term share data, but what I really mean is provide access to data in a very safe way to be able to make better and better predictions. Right. You need the kinds of things we are talking about, as well as the governance mechanisms. So, if you're going to make predictions, how can you have companies collaborate in providing access to their data so you can make the prediction, but not give you their data? Just have a collaboration where for specific business purposes or societal purposes, you can send them a smart contract. You can send them a question that will ask them to analyze what you're looking for with their data and send you back the answer, right, as opposed to all the data has to be in one place, which is very difficult. So the infrastructures we're talking about will enable us to develop all this stuff. By the way, as we are talking, one point that comes to mind is I remember Dan writing a really good article, a couple of years ago maybe, that the biggest issue he saw with blockchain was the governance of blockchain. Am I correct in that?
Sure. We've just recently released a very important report on that topic. So yes, governance is a key issue because it goes to business, it goes to social contracts. It's kind of fundamental. And what we're talking about with these very advanced uses of AI is the governance of these ecosystems to be able to provide access to data. And now, by the way, governance is not an infrastructure topic. It is maybe 2 levels above it. But it's enabled by infrastructure, right? You can't have good governance without good, strong, stable functional infrastructure, right? It's a
and
byproduct.
I suspect that one of the major objectives of BRI, as it now moves into, let me say, the W3 timeframe, will be not just to work on the infrastructures, but to work on applications and governance with its partners.
So that this begs kind of the big and kind of finalish question in this that I have as part of this podcast, and that is, okay, so there's this group of technologies collectively known as W3. They have some very, very important and fundamental characteristics that suggests that a whole bunch of things are going to change in some fundamental ways.
Yes.
That new things will become possible, that industries are going to be completely transformed because they now have access to this new technology. I mean, if you go back and look at economic and business theory, the rationale for the existence of companies and bigger companies is that they can create zones of very low friction.
Right.
That they can, compose skills and
right.
services and goods in the pursuit of creating, compound goods that they can put in the marketplace competitively. But the question is that if all of that rationale now becomes embedded into the fabric of a network,
yes,
what does that mean for the structure of business and the economy? I mean,
it will enable collaboration. It will enable ecosystems of companies to work together. But that's always been the case. I mean, look at supply chains.
Sure.
Look at innovation. So it will enable us to significantly it will enable us to reduce the friction in collaborations. That's what's really important in this next evolution of the internet.
Yeah, the way I've kind of thought about it is, and I think the supply chain is a really good example, that the supply chains, by virtue of limitations in the supporting infrastructure, have largely been about the interaction between the boundary conditions, right? That one company's interacting with another company and they see whatever the company ships them, right? And there's a finite amount of information. But in a blockchain world, all the members of a supply chain can have a collective understanding of what's going on and thus a much deeper insight so that they can make much better quality decisions. And many more smaller economic actors can work together in concert as if they were a big company. It's kind of like traffic, right? Most of
that's the promise, and let me repeat it once more, over the long term.
Sure.
Because all this, we have some of the components in place, but all this takes quite a bit of work.
I think that's true, and especially because it is a foundational technology. I also think that it's true that every once in a while, there comes along a set of circumstances which unnaturally accelerates era shifts. And often they're born out of, conflict, economic hardship, where you get a sorting where, kind of the more frivolous ideas get discarded. There's a concentration on quality, and there is a high incentive to innovate. And I think that, the pandemic, and now combined with the energy crisis because of the conflict, the war in Europe, that these are the kinds of circumstances that may in fact accelerate.
I agree. I absolutely agree with you. Everybody agrees that the pandemic has accelerated the transition to a 21st century digital economy by years. Yeah. Everybody agrees.
Yeah, I think in supply chain that 8 years of innovation will likely be squished into the next 18 months.
Yeah, look at things like telehealth.
Right, or Zoom, right? I mean,
look at you and I doing this.
Exactly.
And we are living our lives online far more than before. It doesn't mean we don't live our physical lives as well, but we're doing much more online. But the infrastructure to enable us to do this online live more securely, with more privacy, hasn't quite been there. That part is what's been missing, and that's what we're trying to start building out with Web3. That's a very good way of putting it, though.
It's a very, very exciting world that we're living in, and the world that's emerging. We haven't written that history yet, and we have some new building blocks, some new capabilities, some new infrastructure that humankind, society, has never been able to leverage before. And I think we're only going to be bound by our imaginations. And that's it's an exciting time to be in this industry. It's an exciting time to be in any industry. There's going to be people that are uncomfortable with change, but I'm convinced, at least, that the world we're moving towards is going to be one that is much more equitable, that value can get created in accelerated ways and be distributed across the economy and society much more broadly. And that's tremendously exciting. And I hope that it's going to allow us to tackle some big issues like the big ESG climate crisis and other issues that we have to collectively deal with.
All I can say is amen.
Yeah. Thank you, Irving. And as always, it's been great fun to explore the emerging Web3 space with you. And thank you all for joining us for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find more research on this topic at the blockchainresearchinstitute.org. I'm your host, Doug Heintzman. We hope you'll join us for our next episode of W3B Talks.